Liberty. Hello, Liberty-meers. It's nice to see you tonight, and welcome to this week's edition of our Sunday night discussion of literature, great literature in the history of liberty. I've selected my favorite 25 books, and it's fun. I've been doing this now for a while, and every week a new book comes along, and every time I'm surprised. I go, "Oh my goodness, I can't believe I'm doing that book this week. That's one of my favorite books." Well, I hand-selected these things, so that's why they're my favorite books. This week we're doing Etienne de la Boétie's Politics of Obedience. It's a wonderful book from the Renaissance, from the High Renaissance in Italy, written by an Italian aristocrat who's puzzling with the great question, why do people obey the state, and why don't they just decline to obey completely? So I don't want to spend a lot of time on the book, but I do want to spend a lot of time talking about the problem of political obedience itself, because that itself is a fascinating subject. And I'm coming to this subject tonight, having spent a good part of the day reading a remarkable monograph, really book, that I'm willing to bet you have not read. Okay, so I hadn't read it until yesterday and today, and I'm now totally entranced by the thing. It's so I'm going to juxtapose these two texts. One, Politics of Obedience, by Etienne de la Boétie, Renaissance thinker, Italian aristocrat, not an anarchist, I don't think, but a very interesting thinker in his own right, who's, as far as we know, the first modern thinker that really dealt and grappled in detail with the mystery of political obedience. With Joseph Schumpeter's great work called The Sociology of Imperialisms, which I also want to talk about. It's from 1918, right at the close of the Great War. He discusses the great issue of imperialism. Where does it come from? What does it amount to? How come it exists? And what I find fascinating is that their views dovetail to a great extent. Both of them come up with the same basic answer to the great mystery. Well, what is the mystery actually we're dealing with? I mean, why is it a mystery at all that people obey the state? Well, from Boétie's point of view, you have to consider the time in which he was writing, which was really the birth of modernity as we know it. We're talking about a 16th century Italy, which was experiencing a level of prosperity that had never been seen ever, exceeding even the height of Rome. We're coming out of 15 centuries of difficulty, growing technology, but nonetheless living standards, at least in Europe proper, never quite got to the level that they had achieved for the aristocracy in old Roman times. And now, for the first time in the 16th century, we're seeing something that nobody had ever seen before, namely the prospering of, and the birth and prospering of, a new middle class. This had never been seen before. Even since the ancient world, it had always been assumed that people were born into a certain station of life, and there they remained. You were part of the ruling class, part of the aristocracy, and you remained there, and nothing could dislodge you. You were born a merchant into the merchant class, you stayed there, and nothing would change that very lowly fate. You were born a slave, and you would always be a slave. And whatever your allotted role in life was, that's where it remained. Your life was relatively short, depending on the amount of money and wealth you had, and nonetheless, this thing we call progress, or this thing we now think of as being social aspiration, like, I want to get somewhere in life. I want to do something with my life. I want to take control of my life and achieve something wonderful, and die in a better position than I came. Indeed, I want to advance over my parents. I would like to ascend a social class and create wealth for myself and for others. These opportunities had never existed before, and we just began to see them in the 16th century. You can tell None of us were there, but we can experience what it must have been like just by looking at the art and the music. I mean, you can see it in the vital statistics, right? I mean, suddenly you saw, the last of the Black Deaths in Europe were over. Sanitary conditions were improving. Access to food was growing, available to, and wider varieties of foods. Not just what you grew on your feudal lands that were allocated to you. You had access to a whole variety of foods. Interestingly, average people started getting this incredibly prized possession for the first time in history called money. Money had only been available to states and aristocracies until that time in Europe. And suddenly money was available to everybody. Money is very cool because, not because it represents wealth, that's the least of it. The point of money is that it represents choice. You have the money, and now you can go out and choose various articles that you can buy. You can choose to invest it, you can choose to spend it, you can choose what you want to spend it on. Having access to that level of choice is extraordinary. That's very different from being paid in kind. For 1,000 years, 1,500 years previous, you were happy to be paid in the form of security services. The feudal lord would protect you from invasion. You're glad to be able to eat, and so you were given food, and that was a glorious thing. You didn't mind it. I mean, feudalism was in many ways a great advance. But coming out of the feudal period, now suddenly people had money. They could go to the cities. Travel was becoming ever more safe, and which is an amazing thing to be able to actually travel and not get mugged. Guns and weapons and things to protect yourself were more and more available. Roads were becoming more paved, pathways and maps more accessible to people. And you experienced choice. You could even move, which is an amazing thing. You could choose where you wanted to live. You could select between jurisdictions, and even change nationalities. So in this period, especially the aristocracy began to kind of move around. The Germans would become French, and the French would become Italians, and the Italians would become English, and so on, developing new names for themselves. We saw really the birth of modernity. And you can see it in the paintings. I mean, a lot of the paintings of this period, the High Renaissance, featured pictures of food, like, how great is that? Food. It's awesome. Food is really awesome. Pictures of peasants dancing, fat peasants in unusually opulent clothing. I mean, these things they look a little absurd to us. Like, why you show me a picture of a bunch of sea animals dripping off of a table? I mean, it's kind of disgusting. Well, it wasn't in the 16th century. That was the greatest thing you could ever see. Markets full of fresh food, and peasants dancing, in clothes that were once reserved for the aristocracy. This is a glorious time. You could hear it in the music. Music of 1,000 years earlier was still severe and uncomplicated, reflective of much simpler times, and the prospect of death. You could almost hear it in every note. Suddenly, this is 100 years earlier. 100 years later, you begin to get the advent of very complex polyphonic sounds that were always aspirational and ascending. You can just feel it in ever more complex compositions designed to be deployed in a wide variety of architectural settings that were extremely elaborate. And hope is in the air. It's a wonderful thing. But there's a strange holdover from the Middle Ages, from feudal times, that Etienne de la Boétie draws attention to, namely the existence of a pillaging, robbing, looting, demanding overlord. Still there. Despite all the progress in the world, we still had this weird atavistic holdover from the past namely rulers that they're dared to impose their vision of the world upon us, take portions of our earnings, in exchange for which they provided various services and things. Increasingly, the services were less and less valuable. The market was providing what the feudal overlords once provided. So why do we keep these people around? Why do we continue to comply? Now, the short answer to that, the easy answer, is that, well, they have the monopoly on guns. But Etienne's de la Boétie's point was that, well, who gave them the monopoly on guns? How do we first acquiesce and give in to the system where only the rulers, only the elites, only the state has the right to impose massive violence on us, and not face prosecution? If we impose violence on each other, aggressive violence, if I take your stuff, you take my stuff, I kill you, you kill me, it was generally considered to be a prosecutable offense, something immoral, something egregious, so at the very least something deeply regrettable. But when the king does it, when the overlord does it, when the ruling class does it, to us it's legal and it's permitted, and so they exercise this monopoly on violence. Where did they get it from? And de la Boétie says very frankly, we gave it to them. There's no other way to obtain a monopoly except by acquiescence of the population. We gave it to them out of fear, out of the belief they're going to give us something that we can't get on our own, perhaps. Whatever the reason, they have that monopoly. And he goes further. He says that this monopoly alone is not enough to maintain the rule. I mean, after all, the feudal lord is just one guy. A state is only just a handful. Even the nation state, which was being born at this time, developing an entrenched bureaucracy with permanent employees and things, it's still a tiny minority of the population. It's the 1%. To use the language of Occupy Wall Street. It's funny when you think about the language of the Occupy Wall Street. They're drawing attention to the fact that the ruling class is the 1%. And the 1% was pillaging the rest of us, by which they meant Goldman Sachs and were just the wealthy. Okay, they were wrong in that, but their insight that society consists of the ruled and the rulers, and that the rulers are the 1%, and that they run the system for themselves. That's a profound insight. I mean, this is the great takeaway from the Occupy movement, from the 1% movement. It's exactly right. They just had it slightly wrong in identifying the wealthy, although there's a profound degree of overlap between the real ruling class and the wealthy. Obviously, the analysis is just slightly wrong in the sense that the real 1% of those people that have obtained a monopoly on violence and lorded over the rest of it, it's always a tiny percent. And when the rest of the people, the 99%, say no, we will not comply, we will not go along, the 1% is powerless to do anything about it. All the guns in the world will not maintain the rule of a 1% that is loathed and hated and disobeyed by the 99%. It cannot happen. And that's Boétie's point, that in the end, despite the monopoly on violence, which we gave them, all the power they have is power that we permitted them to have. The power they exercise over us is nonetheless still ineffective in the face of a non-compliant population, people that resist. And he has all sorts of great language that he uses about this. And maybe I can just read some quick things. So some of the best stuff. I should like to merely understand how it happens that so many men, so many villages, so many cities, so many nations sometimes suffer under a single tyrant who has no other power than the power they give him, who's able to harm them only to the extent to which they have the willingness to bear with him, who could do them absolutely no injury unless they preferred to put up with him rather than contradict him. Surely a striking situation. Yet it is so common that one must grieve the more and wonder the less at the spectacle of 1,000,000 men serving in wretchedness, their necks under the yoke, not constrained by a greater multitude than they. Should we call subjection to such a leader cowardice? If 100, if 1,000 endure the caprice of a single man, should we not rather say that they lack not the courage, but the desire to rise against him, and that such an attitude indicates indifference rather than cowardice? But not 100, not 1,000, but 100 providences and 1,000 cities and 1,000,000 men refuse to assail a single man, from whom the kindest treatment received is the infliction of serfdom and slavery. What should we call that? Is it cowardice? When 1,000, 1,000,000 men, 1,000 cities fail to protect themselves against the domination of one man, this cannot be called cowardly, for cowardice does not sink to such depth. What monstrous vice, then, is this which does not even deserve to be called cowardice, a vice which no term can be found vile enough? This is what Boétie is asking. He says the tyrant has nothing more than the power you confer upon him to destroy you. Where has he acquired enough eyes to spy upon you if you do not provide them yourselves? How can he have so many arms to beat you with if he does not borrow them from you? The feet that trample down your cities, where does he get them, if not of your own? How does he have any power over you except through you? How would he dare to assail you if he had not cooperation from you? So this is the kind of thing that Boétie gives, a revolutionary document, really. And then the most famous statement of all, he gives his answer. He says, resolve to serve no more, and you are at once freed. Do not ask that you place your hands upon the tyrant to topple him over. You don't need to kill the feudal lord. You don't need to kill the king. But simply that you support him no longer. Then you will behold him like a great colossus whose pedestal has been pulled away, fall of its own weight, and break into pieces. So it's extraordinary. It's an extraordinary document in many ways, and you can see why it is that so many revolutionaries in the 500 years hence have read this document and adhered to its teachings and attempted to inspire people to implement Boétie's recommendations, that we just don't comply, that we remove our permission to be ruled, and under those conditions the power does indeed topple. Now you might say, well, that's unrealistic. Actually, it's not really. I mean, in my lifetime I saw this happen. I saw this very thing happen in Russia. It was an extraordinary thing. It's just like a brief moment in time came and the entire Soviet state collapsed. All the captive nations, so-called, took back the powers unto themselves, and it happened all over the entire region. It happened all over Eastern Europe, almost in the blink of an eye. From Romania to the Czech Republic to Poland, East Germany with the Berlin Wall, Latvia seceded, Lithuania seceded, the Soviet Union as an empire completely collapsed, and all the eastern provinces went. And the great dictator of the time resigned. Politburo and government offices all over Europe, Eastern Europe, and Russia were taken over by the people. Extraordinary. A mere 100 years, not even 100 years, more like 70 years after it had happened, the same exact scene had come about that's with the Bolshevik Revolution itself, where the Tsar and all of his powers, one of the most powerful regimes in all of Europe and all the world, just suddenly crumbled down. In that case, it was due to a murder, but the people were the real power, and they always are in the case of revolutions. And we see this again and again. States do collapse. They collapse when they no longer enjoy the confidence of the people. And when that confidence is removed, when it collapses, when there's a change, and it's changes in the air, and it's universal, and the paradigm can shift very, very quickly. And suddenly the most permanent, the most powerful regime in the world suddenly just becomes completely powerless. It suddenly becomes obsolete. And the 1% disappear. It's an extraordinary thing. So the reason it happens is not because states fail to use the violence, although they oftentimes fear using violence under those conditions. It happens because of an ideological turn. So Boétie is asking the question, why doesn't it happen all the time? And the answer is that people, for whatever reason, come to be persuaded that the power that's ruling them is for the good, that there's some reason that they need it. In other words, it's an ideological puzzle. It's an ideological, the answer comes down to what we happen to believe. And I think about this in the case of the US. I mean, you look at American politics today, and everybody's got complaints about the existing regime. Its priorities are wrong. It's doing egregious things here. It's doing that. It's engaging in the wrong wars. It's giving money to the wrong amount of to the wrong people. It's got the wrong regulations. Its priorities are incorrect. Everybody will meet has a complaint about how the regime goes about its business. It's deeply unpopular. The status quo is probably always has been, ever more so now. But the question is, whether this opposition is to particular priorities of the regime, policies of the regime, practices of the regime, or to the existence of the regime itself. And that's a crucial difference. In this sense, people who have imagined the possibility of a society without the state are way ahead of those who continue to hold on to the myth, I think, that somehow if we did away with it, we'll unleash some terrible chaos that would be as probably worse than the status quo. I mean, so long as you believe that, as long as you believe that that's true, you are giving up some of your freedom to the regime. You are contributing part of your mind and part of your belief structure and part of your heart and part of your soul to the survival of the regime. In the end, you're just arguing about the policies, the priorities of the regime, but you're not arguing about the regime itself. And that's all really any ruling class needs to maintain its power. It needs you to believe that without that power, civilization would dissolve into some regrettable state. Now, what are those regrettable states? And so every ruling class always has a scenario of a nightmare scenario that is likely to happen in its absence. It's a big job of court intellectuals to find that rationale. One quick moment. No, okay, that's good. I was making sure I was on the right microphone. It's a big job of court intellectuals to find that rationale. Now, it changes in different times, in different places. It's always different. Just to paint with a very broad brush, in the Middle Ages, the age of faith, as they say, the king always ruled with the permission and acquiescence and helping hand of a clerical class. So the purpose of the state, the rationale of the state was always bound up in some sense with religion, because that's where the priorities of the people are. States are actually very good at finding out discerning the cultural moment, seizing it, and saying, oh, see, that's why we need the state. And when the values of society change, so too the rationale for why we have to have a state changes. So with the rise of new science and the Renaissance and Enlightenment, and afterwards, particularly in the 19th century, suddenly the state itself becomes the guarantor of science. It becomes the embodiment of reason, protecting you against superstition, for example, and reactionary attitudes. The state becomes an instrument of progress. Of course, it's not an instrument of progress. It never has been. It can't be. But it reinvents itself, to do whatever the thing is that you want it to do. You think about the Constitution in a way. I mean, by any standard, the U.S. Constitution created a new state. It took a society, a post-revolutionary society, without any kind of viable, working, coercive central government. The Articles of Confederation were truly just a compact among independent governments, but not the creation of government itself. It was, Murray Rothbard used to say, it was probably the closest thing we've seen to anarchy in the modern world. Ruling class got together, hammered together a constitution, and they reemerged on the other side and say, here's our great new constitution. Well, what does this constitution do, according to the people who hammered it out, which you can read about in the Federalist Papers? Well, they will tell you, because all of society loved freedom, loved a world without arbitrary central power, government run amok, the burning memory of the Revolutionary War, of overthrowing the foreign tyrants who were taxing people and jailing people without trial and so on. What people loved more than anything else was freedom. So what do you know? This new constitution, the priority of the newly created government, the newly created ruling class that didn't previously exist, very powerful president, new institutions like Supreme Court and Senate and legislatures and enumerated powers, of the new government. The purpose of this new government, according to those people who gave us the Constitution, was to protect the thing that people valued the most, which was freedom. Now, how do you do that? I mean, why would you create a new, comparatively gigantic state to protect freedom that was already there? I mean, why would you need to do this? I mean, you don't create a new gigantic state in order to have more freedom. Almost by definition, a new gigantic state is going to take away freedom, right? That's just what they do. So, but the Constitution was marketed as a liberal program, even though it was clearly creating a new government. So it's a great illustration of how states always discern the cultural moment and enlist the intellectuals and the propagandists of the public to push out and spread an ideology that leads people to acquiesce to the new form of rule. It's very revealing that this has to happen. I mean, if the Constitution had come about in a way that's just said, we need a big new government because the wealthy landed aristocracy need to have some way to control the financial system and to tax people and to rig the social structure for their benefit at your expense, yeah, obviously the Constitution never would have been passed and we wouldn't be saddled with the thing today. But there always has to be an ideological rationale. It's not enough just to have violence. Violence alone has no power in the absence of an ideological structure that is designed to bolster and provide a moral and consequentialist rationale for why the state has to exist. So this is Boétie's point. And it's also David Hume. And Mises makes this point. Many others have made this point. that powerful states are ultimately backed not by their monopoly on violence or the guns that they own or the laws they enforce, but by the belief structure that gives them legitimacy. It's what you and I believe about the world that is the ultimate source of their power. In a smaller sense, we see this in the normal course of political life, just as it emerges over time. And let me just give one quick example of this. So about 25 years ago, there was a piece of legislation passed called the Americans with Disabilities Act. A very interesting piece of legislation. I'll tell you a story that I might actually write up this week in an article, because I've been thinking about this subject a lot. Now, there's no question the Americans with Disabilities Act was a catastrophe for disabled people in America. And you can look at this with the unemployment data. Unemployment is vastly higher among disabled people today than it was 25 years ago. Whereas there were a great deal of public sympathy towards the disabled and a growing movement to accommodate disabled people in every way before the act came about. After the act, now you've seen a change even in that. They're less integrated into the division of labor, ever more likely to be shut out from the social economic life of the nation. In fact, I was really outraged. I mean, all the celebratory articles about 25 years of the ADA, they would talk about, oh, it's so great, the disabled have all these great new rights. And every once in a while you would see a little mention in passing that it's true that we haven't made as much progress in employment as we might have liked. In fact, for reasons we don't entirely understand, employment is actually down relative to what it was 25 years ago among disabled populations. So that's something we still have to work on. Well, I mean, I don't know these commentators. I mean, it's like, if you don't have a job and you're not working, it means that you're not being valuable in the marketplace. You are shut out from the rest of society. If you want a job and you can't get a job, and so you are living as a complete dependent, there's no sense in which you can say that you're integrated into the life of a community. I mean, if you are literally prohibited from being valuable to other people in a remunerative way, or even in a non-remunerative way. I mean, if there's just simply no role for you, you're not part of the community. So, I mean, people who claim that this act has done good are just completely oblivious to reality. But anyway, the reason I bring this up, and by the way, I had a weird role in this whole thing. Because I was just fresh out of college, and disability rights has always been a big concern for me personally. I've always felt a little bit of a calling to do something about this issue, because I've known disabled people. I think maybe you know the story about my coworker when I was my first job in a department store was severely disabled, and I became very, very close to him, and I've always felt this sort of calling to lend whatever kind of efforts I have on behalf of disabled people. I feel very fortunate to have, everything about me works the right way. I don't have any, physical disabilities at all, or even learning disabilities or anything like that. I've always felt like that was a set of, by the grace of God in a way, and I always felt a great sympathy for those people who have terrible accidents that cause them to have disabilities, or were born with things that limited their functioning, and felt a great deal of appreciation for them. And so, fresh out of college, I actually had the opportunity to go to work for, I believe it was called the National Association of Disabled Americans, or something like that. I'll have to look this up, get the name exactly right. National Association for Disability Rights, or something like that. and a very wealthy paraplegic who was heading the organization. And I had a connection there, so I went to Washington, and while I was in journalism school, also worked with this organization, thinking that because it was pushing legislation on behalf of the disabled, that there's no doubt that this would be a good thing. I mean, I was young and naive. I didn't realize, I didn't understand that even disabled people wouldn't entirely understand what was in their best interest. But I figured that if there was a big piece of legislation being passed, it had to be good for them, right? I mean, how can you doubt that? Nonetheless, I had been an economics major, so I kind of knew enough about incentives and regulation and stuff like that to kind of at least tease out the truth. And as I began to look at the Americans with Disabilities Act and look at what was past policies, the effects of past policies on behalf of the disabled, and the likely effects of the new one, I grew very alarmed. Over the course of about 2 months of study, I put together a huge report. It's a big, thick report that basically concluded that if this act was passed, that it would lead to mass unemployment among disabled people, and would lead people to get fewer benefits, and lead to an intensification of public resentment against the disabled, and would cause lots of wasteful spending that would accommodate people in ways that they didn't need to be accommodated, at the expense of providing for ways that they did need to be accommodated. And I demonstrated all this with a great deal of empirical data and detailed argument. And I went to the major funder of this National Disabilities Organization. And by the way, I came to these conclusions after many detailed interviews with lobbyists, politicians, disability rights activists, detailed study of budgets and bureaucracies and everything else. Okay, so I'm just a child, right? But I was very interested in this. And I was alarmed to discover this. And I thought, wow, when I reveal this to the head of this organization, he's going to be shocked and back off and completely change his legislation. So I took him the report and explained to him what was going on. And he was just outraged. And he exploded at me and said, that's ridiculous. It seems to me that, I thought you were in favor of us, but it seems to me that all you're doing is declining to advance our rights. And you're actually becoming a problem. The kinds of views you hold are actually holding back our progress as a community. So either get on board with this or get out. Well, obviously I knew exactly what I had to do, and I got out. So it's intriguing to me, 25 years, to see that everything that I thought was going to happen indeed did happen, but the disabled community, continues to be completely mystified by this. Anyway, the reason I'm telling the story is that it's a great illustration. I mean, the disabled were making great progress in the many years before that to, on a voluntary basis, enlighten the public about the needs for accommodations to physical structures, the needs for employment, the rise of a great deal of philanthropic organizations to push for disability rights. And there was a heightened awareness. It had been building for decades and decades, and we were really making great progress. Well, now you had economically, ignorant activists working with politicians who are anxious to grab onto any issue to claim credit for it, and gigantic bureaucracies that are always looking for more ways to improve their budgets and expand their empire, all conspiring to take what was a beautiful social movement and heavily politicize it, entrench it, embed it in law, and reverse all the progress we've made so far. It's a great illustration of the way the state works. It takes a prevailing social consensus and grabs it and entrenches it in law as a way of sort of claiming credit for it, as a way of saying, look, without the ruling class, the disabled would never get employment. They would always be second-class citizens. There'll always be they'll always be considered, excluded from the mainstream of life. So that's why we need the state. So why else do we need the state? You can go through the list. I mean, every great social movement in American history, and this is true, all over the world and all throughout human history. Whenever there's a state around, they tend to grab onto that social movement, entrench it into law, claim credit for the advances, reverse the progress. They're blind to their failures. Nonetheless, they've provided a rationale for continued compliance with the dictates of the elites. It's been true over the rights of Black Americans, women, wages, just as they're accelerating suddenly, and ever more people involved in the division of labor, then you get the creation of the Department of Labor, and so on. I mean, every time the state takes over one of these movements, it stops the progress, oftentimes reverses it, but nonetheless provides the government ever more rationale for why it must be in charge. Because by God, if they weren't ruling us, then there would be some terrible fate would befall us. And we see this under the rationale for the national security state too. I promised you that I would talk a little bit about Schumpeter, and this is the point at which I'd like to bring this up. So Schumpeter's book is called The Sociology of Imperialisms, and he deliberately puts an S on that because there are many forms of empire in history, and he talks about the Roman Empire, the Assyrian Empire, the Arab Empire, the Persian Empire, and the German Empire, British Empire, U.S. empire, and its relationship to capitalism and the rationales that are behind them. And every empire works slightly differently. And in his view, some are incredibly benevolent, like the Persian Empire. They take over a country, instead of killing everybody, changing the language, changing their customs, abolishing their laws, raping the women, and pillaging all the property, forcing property to change hands, and so on. The Persian Empire was remarkably benevolent. It would take the existing aristocracy, elevate them to the new ruling class, and provide more services than they had previously, and inaugurate new trading relationships that led to a greater degree of wealth. The only thing that the Persian Empire ever did was insist that the newly conquered peoples had to finally acknowledge the Persian king as the final ruler. But apart from that, maximum autonomy was allowed. This is exactly opposite from the Assyrians, who were murderous and pillaging and cruel, just as an end in itself. The Roman Empire was the classic case of an empire that was run entirely for the entrenchment and well-being of a domestic ruling class. Roman aristocracy, always fearing revolution, would do anything possible to keep the public in a constant state of frenzied fear of foreigners, and a constant state of celebratory congratulation for military commanders and Caesars who defeated them. And so what was the purpose of that empire? The empire was to shore up domestic politics. That's not always the reason for empire, but it was the reason for the Roman Empire. The Arab Empire is typically ascribed to religious motives, the spread of Islam, but Schumpeter disputes that and says that here again, religion provided the pretext for keeping everybody in a constant state of militarized desire for ever more advance. But ultimately, the Arab Empire, the purpose of the Arab Empire was to perpetuate a sense of unity among certain peoples, to prohibit them from turning inward on endless theological struggles and competition for local rule. So it's to prevent decentralization and localism. That was the purpose of the Arab Empire. And so on he goes. He marches through all these various forms of imperialism, each one having a different rationale. The one rationale that he says is not a good basis for explaining how they existed, how and why they existed, was material acquisition. He says that after the age of capitalism came along, the producer class, and ever more the middle class, the consumers and the workers and the merchant class, and even the ruling class, discovered a beautiful thing, that they could actually gain more material wealth through trade than they could through empire. So it marked the end of the age of empire. But he said even before then, material acquisition of land and wealth from other countries was a prize of imperialism, but it was never the basis for it. Imperialism always has to have a social and cultural basis in the belief of the people. The people have to believe that the empire does them some good, or else they would never go along with it. And typical people are never benefited by empire, like ever. It wasn't true in Roman times, the Syrian Empire, Persian Empire, Arab Empire, British Empire. The people are never benefiting from empire. So why do they go along? They have to have some other rationale that's manufactured for them. This will help spread the faith. This will protect you from foreign enemies. This will illustrate the greatness of Rome. This will keep us unified as one people, and so on. There always has to be this realm of ideas that is the controlling force that keeps the leadership, the dictator, the king, the lord, the tyrant in charge. If it weren't for that ideological superstructure, all states and all times and all places would collapse instantly. And this ideological infrastructure is far more powerful than all the guns and weaponry and all the money that the states own. It's the realm of ideas that keeps states in charge. So you can see that how Schumpeter's analysis here fits very beautifully with Boétie's analysis. They both work together. One dealing with a local tyrant, Boétie. Why do we acquiesce? Why do we go along? It's because we believe that we would be worse off in his absence. And the reason we believe that is that we're surrounded by intellectuals or clerics or whoever they may be that are constantly telling us that this is true. And then on the international level with Schumpeter, why do we put up with military empire? Why do we go along with something that's so unbelievably expensive, damaging, immoral, pillaging, costly, inefficient, disruptive of our lives? Why do we go along? Well, there has to be some ideological rationale, and the rationale is always changing, depending on what it is that people really want from their government. Government's always there to give us whatever we want it to do. Not well, not consistently, not in a way that's always consistent with human rights. But so long as people believe that there's a worse fate in absence of power, they'll always be willing to stick with power. A brief departure here on U.S. elections. I find myself very interested in the current election season. I'm not sure I can account for that entirely. I've been radically uninterested in politics for upwards of 10 years, but now I'm suddenly really interested in everything that's going on. Of course, I'm watching Donald Trump very carefully, and he strikes me as a perfect embodiment of a sort of 21st century version of a clownish sort of fascism, but tapping into something very real. And the rest of these clowns all running for the Republican nomination, and then ultimately facing a general election where we're going to have, the Browns versus the Reds once again. I don't think there's any doubt about that. That's what's coming. But it's a fascinating thing, isn't it? How people are led to believe that because of the election, we are ourselves in a position of having choice and having some say over the regime under which we live. That's what, since Roman times, since the ancient world, that's what everybody aspired. That's what freedom meant. Freedom meant to have some part in the crafting of the policies of the regime under which you live. So these elections are designed to let us believe this. Of course, it's utter rot. This is our ideological rationale. This is our superstructure. That we go along with, just as we go out and buy things in the marketplace, and Americans believe in individual rights and having choice over our lives. So too, we have a political system in which we're permitted maximum amount of choice over who rules us and the policies they implement. Ultimately, we're in charge, right? And that's the whole basis of this election system. And it's laughable once you look at the details of the thing, because it turns out, first of all, we don't actually vote over policies. We're only voting over the people who are promising to implement certain policies. Whether they do or not is something you and I can't control. All we can do is vote for Bob or Jane, essentially. We're not actually voting on what kind of government we're going to have. We only voting over the personnel, and we have absolutely no control over what they do with that power once we grant it to them. So that's laughable. But there's a second aspect of it that is, and I'm leaving aside the fact that one person actually has absolutely no effect whatsoever on the outcome of the election. You just stay home; it's not going to make any difference. But more intriguingly than that is, we don't actually have an elected government. I mean, if you sort of march through the sheer numbers of people who are ruling us, and you put it on a calculator and consider that against the numbers of people we elect, we're electing less than 0.1% of the people who actually do rule us. I've got the numbers in some article I wrote in the last year, but we're voting for just a tiny sliver. Our real rulers are an entrenched, permanent ruling class, a bureaucracy that's paid for by tax dollars, that is unelected. And actually, for the most part, the elected politicians can't control what's called the deep state. Has no control whatsoever over it, which meaning that you and I have no control over it. So not even in the most optimistic scenario is there anything about modern democracy that amounts to self-government. I mean, it just doesn't. The state of today is no different from the state in ancient times. It's a ruling class that is permanently in place, regardless of anything, independent of anything you and I have any access to, any power that we have, has no effect on them. So I think this again underscores the point about that Boétie and on domestic level and Schumpeter on an international level are making, that the power that the state has is ultimately derived from the belief structure of the society and the culture. And that belief structure is profoundly affected by the propaganda that the court intellectuals are dishing out to us every day. And we're subjected to it, every single day. And those of us who like to announce to the world that this whole thing is a fraud and a ruse, and that we'd be infinitely better off without it, are treated as, crazy radicals, or as somebody put it recently, the fringe of the fringe, even though we believe we're making sense, and I think I'm making sense every single day in everything I write, in a regime dominated by a sort of a statist mind, and a society ruled in which the values of power are always in ascendance, that most people believe that the absence of the state would create a much worse conditions than we presently face, no matter how unsatisfactory present conditions are. Under such a society, the states will always maintain their control and maintain their exploitative position of ruling over the population. So, but should that condition ever change, where people imagine a world in which a statelessness, a world without power, a world in which we don't have a privileged class that can exploit us legally, that can pillage us without consequence. If we're ever going to have that world, what needs to change is the ideological superstructure of the social order. And that's where your voice and my voice and everybody who believes fundamentally in liberty, and I mean real liberty, like no state kind of liberty, like we keep our property, we're in charge of our lives. The social order is formed entirely out of voluntary human engagement and interaction of everybody. And that is the whole basis of the social order. People who believe that are the single most important people, because they're the ones who are going to drive history forward. They're the ones that are charting the new course. And don't forget that this actually did happen in American history. It's a remarkable thing to think of that in 1776, a dominant part of American society believed for a very brief moment that we could get rid of the rulers and be no worse off. We'd be vastly better off. That's an amazing thing to happen. We're far from that at this point. But let me end by discussing something very interesting. It's probably the single most interesting thing about Schumpeter's book. And then maybe I'll just close with a quick word on Boétie, but I'm going to just highlight something Schumpeter said. Now, remember he's writing in 1918. And he's discussing the advent of capitalism. And he says, with capitalism, we discovered something remarkable. We discovered that through trade, through peace, through merchant craft, production, and innovation and entrepreneurship, we discovered that all of us have far more to gain than any of us get out of empire and pillaging and violence. That's a remarkable discovery in human history. It led to the age of laissez-faire in the 19th century. And he says at the close of the Great War, he says, despite this terrible setback of this war, he says, there's no stopping it now. He said, the whole world is utterly and completely and wholly dependent upon the persistence and advance of the capitalist means, by which he means the voluntary means, a world of trade. He says it's not going to happen immediately, but if anybody believes that there will be a reversal, they're wrong. The entire world economy is now utterly dependent upon modern methods of social advance, trade, engagement, peace. The world depends on this. And he says there's no going back. He says, I'm not saying that, he said, the age of empire is over permanently. He said, there are remnants still in existence of the old world, and those will last for a very long time. But let's make it clear that these forms and structures of the old world, where violence is a means, have been diminishing now for 200 years, and are going to continue to do that. Mankind cannot live on pillaging and violence anymore. The way we live is through trade and peace, voluntary association, and the continuing progress in the breakdown of the apparatus of state control, empire, and violence. And he just announces that there's no question that that these are dying out. Now, I'm reading this, we're a century after he wrote this. Long after he wrote this book, we went through the most murderous war in the history of humanity, World War II. skirmishes in Korea, U.S. in Vietnam, U.S. For God's sake, going into Iraq, 3 times, 25 years of hell. I would love to talk about Iraq, by the way, in light of Schumpeter's analysis. We can't do that tonight because we're out of time. Nonetheless, I think you can see after a century in which he wrote those words that he was probably right. Maybe he was a little premature in his analysis, but in the sweep of history, he was right. We are gradually, a little bit at a time, but inevitably, inexorably, leaving behind the structures of the old world, of the feudal world, of a world of autocracy, and headed ever more into a world without empires and without violence, because our lives depend on it. Ultimately, the switch will happen when the belief structure of the social order finally and fully comes to embrace human liberty as the best means to enhance and protect their material well-being, including their safety and their health and their happiness. And then at that moment, we can look forward to that great day, as Boétie says, when the tyrant topples from his throne, powerless and disgraced. And we can look forward to a world of endless peace and plenty. I take comfort from both books, very much so. But thank you for being with me tonight and for discussing these issues with me, or at least, listening as I'm thinking through them. Fascinating topics, fascinating times. And I look forward to seeing you next week. All the best to you. And if you're not a member of Liberty.me, go over and join us. Fabulous library, amazing community. It's your network of friendship and community, publishing to build a freer world. All the best to you.